Welcome, everyone. And joining us today on the show is David Bramwell. To introduce David to everybody a bit, we both met at the OBOD 60th Annual Summer Gathering in Glastonbury, where David was giving a presentation on his Wicker Man sing-along and all things Wicker Man. Um, Being a huge fan of the film, I just couldn't resist, and we talked for quite a bit more after David had presented, and I've been digging into his works ever since. So, welcome, David. Good to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be on.
So, to jump right in, what is it that really draws you to the film The Wicker Man?
Well, I think the music played a big part in this. Um, being a musician, being into folk music, and indie and pastoral, psych folk, and many other genres, the music from The Wicker Man has a haunting quality to it, and the some of the original songs that were written for it, like Willow's song and Gently Johnny, have this sort of plaintive and yet also a kind of evocative and sensual quality to them that was not really there in folk music in the sort of traditional sense in Britain in the 60s and early 70s. Folk had gone weird through bands like the Incredible String Band, but not sensual in that way. It was, there was still an expectation that folk music was sung in a plain with a plainness of voice, a plainness of delivery, and the kind of the parodies of the finger in the ear. Was it The Mighty Wind? I mean, that wonderful film, The Mighty Wind, I think it kind of parodies elements of the folk scene from the 60s and early 70s. And The Wicker Man just I don't know, yeah, the music's like half the film. It's so, and the way it's presented, because it's not a musical, but it could, well, we turned it into a musical, which we'll get onto in a minute. Because the songs are presented in communal settings, there's a naturalness to the way those songs are sung communally. It's not artificial, like somebody walking down the street heartbroken, and then suddenly they break into song, and the milkman and other people in the street sort of join in with them, as you get in other musicals. So there's a sense of authenticity in the way that the music is presented. But even the incidental music in the film, I just love. It's beautiful, whether it's played on recorders or, kind of old stringed instruments, or just more traditional kind of guitar. I think it's extraordinary. And the film holds up really well as a psychological thriller. It doesn't suffer what so many horror films, particularly British horror films of the 60s and 70s had, which was that they could be cheesy. They would use terrible special effects, very hammy acting. There's a bit of hammy acting in The Wicker Man, but it's there's a complexity to the film in that as a viewer, your sympathies are sort of divided between Lord Summerisle and Sergeant Howie, because they both have an authenticity to them and a gravitas to them and a sort of heroic quality to them. But one of them is an uptight Christian copper, and the other is a man who is endorsing murder, essentially, in the name of the continual growth of his crops, or the islanders' crops. So it's a film with a genuinely shocking ending, because there's no resolution. But it is when we do the shows, and there's always audience members who've never seen the film before. So they're introduced to it in a slightly strange way, because it's like an interactive version of it. They're still no less shocked by that ending. They didn't see that ending coming. And yeah, I think those are qualities, and also the fact that Anthony Schafer, who I think was probably the principal person to delve into the traditions and rituals that are presented in the film. I think he did most of the hard work, even though Robin Hardy, the director, may have made other claims after Schafer died. But they wanted to present a pagan lifestyle in what they thought would be a seemingly authentic way, and they drew heavily upon Fraser's Golden Bough, which we now know is a deeply problematic piece of writing because it was the the book that people turn to for looking at folklore and tradition across the world, but it suffers from being written during colonial times and by somebody with whose prejudices, because of that, meant that there's a narrative which goes through that book. I say this, I haven't read it, so okay, I'm offering this as I haven't read Golden Bough all the way through, but a presentation of so-called primitive ideas and beliefs, in inverted commas, of our ancestors in the past being replaced by more sophisticated civilization and ways of living by Western colonialists, and we know where that got us, don't we? So who's to say that our ancestors of the past lived in a more primitive way? They probably lived in a more harmonious way, and there's a lot we can learn from them. So, but the film presents. The film, it's not like a film like Blood on Satan's Claw, which is fun. It's a fun horror film, and it's often lumped in with The Wicker Man in terms of it being a folk horror classic. But it's pretty silly. The Wicker Man, there is a sense of it feels plausible, the way that life is presented on the island. So I think those are some of the reasons why I think the film has endured, why I love the film. And I also think it's just a bloody good story. It's a really, really good story. It's a cat and mouse. It's a classic cat and mouse.
What was it that inspired you to kick off the sing-along performances of The Wicker Man?
We're not entirely sure. So for 15 years, I've been doing it with my friend Eliza Skelton. And for any Doctor Who fans out there, Eliza's father was the voice of all the Daleks in Doctor Who, from 1963 to the 90s, before Doctor Who got a reboot in the noughties. And so Eliza comes from a background of actors and performers, and the two of us were then and still are now playing in a band together, and both fans of the soundtrack of the film. We decided that it might be fun to do a live performance, to learn all the songs, and do a live show where we just we do those 8 or 9 songs from the film, and then we don't really know what happened, but by some leap of imagination from the gods, whatever, from alcohol, who knows, somebody said, what if we turn it into a sing-along? Yeah, and we'll make it lo-fi, and we'll get goodie bags for audience members with little surprises inside. There'll be edible foreskins, there'll be edible umbilical cords, there'll be little chewy frogs. And when there's the taking of the sacrament, we'll put a Smartie, a little chocolate sweet in, and people can feed each other Smarties. So, and it drew the mischief out of us. And so we have boards, we have big boards that we hold up to give instructions to the audience during the film. So we don't speak during the film, we don't want to interrupt it that way. And we run amongst the audience, handing out fake photographs of the missing girl, Rowan Morrison, getting people to pass them along every time that happens in the film. And I don't know, it felt like the film was asking for it. It's like we didn't have to work too hard in finding a way to present the film in a fun, interactive way, but not to completely undermine the psychological horror that unfolds in the film when it gets to the end. Even though audiences come dressed as generally come dressed in pagan attire, they love to bring masks. Sometimes people go way overboard. We had a person came in a suit made entirely out of wicker blinds. We've had people come dressed as some of the cakes from the sweetie shop, from Mae Morrison's sweetie shop window. We've had some of knowledge costumes, but little details. People really go for little details. Very rarely do they come dressed as policemen. We've had about 3 in 15 years. You've got to be a bit of a masochist. So yeah, all of those, I forgot where my train of thought was going with that, but it evolved quite naturally, and we didn't really intend to do any more with it other than do a couple of shows in Brighton where we live, in a small venue which had invited us to come and do these songs, and it sold out so quickly and people were sort of clamoring. So, "Oh, I missed it. I missed that. It sounded amazing. You're singing Wicker Man." So we were approached by the main cinema in the or main independent cinema in the town, Duke of York's, capacity 250. They said, "Would you come and do it for Halloween?" And we went, "Well, we'll give it a go." And it sold out. So we've gone from a tiny venue to a medium capacity cinema. That sold out. And we thought, maybe we've got something here. Maybe this is a thing. So we approached a cinema in London called the Ritzy in Brixton and said, "Would you be interested in," before I finished the sentence, it was yes, yes, yes. People, what's lovely about the show is you can phone up a venue or contact a festival or a theatre or whatever, and it's just an instant yes or no. If they're Wicker Man fans, they jump on it, and if they're not, they're just like, no, why would I want to put that? So we did this show in Brixton, and it sold out. And the venue phoned us and said, "This chap phoned. He wants to come along." He explained that it had sold out, but he claims to be the director of the film. And I said, "What's his name?" And they said, "Well, Robin Hardy." I said, "Well, he is the director of the film. Let him come." So Robin started joining us. This was 2012, let's say. I think I'm forgetting now. We'd been doing, I think we'd been doing it for about a year or two by then. And Robin came, and he was promoting a new film he'd made called The Wicker Tree, which, if you're a Wicker Man fan, I don't, I don't recommend it any more than I'd recommend seeing the Nicolas Cage remake, if I'm being brutally honest. And so I'm sorry to the memory of Robin, but it's not a great film. But Robin was sort of piggybacking a little bit on our show, and there was mutual back scratching there because we were absolutely over the moon to have the director of the film there, but also a little uncomfortable that we are teasing and in places having fun with some of the dialogue and some of the clunkier elements of the film, which are there, and some of the cheesy moments, which are also there. But he took it in good humor. So and from then it sort of sold itself. One day we'll get around to making a website for it and doing proper social media, but to just, let it roll and largely for people to approach us. We've probably done it about 200 times now. So I've seen that film a lot.
One thing that's particularly interesting about the film from a pagan perspective is it inspires a lot of really strong feelings within the broader movement. I've definitely met some folks that are like, "Oh no, that film's terrible. I couldn't possibly watch it," and other people that are like, "What do you mean it's a horror film? I love it." And all kinds of opinions in between. Um, and I also know that this previous summer is not the first time that you've presented on the Wicker Man sing along and the Wicker Man to pagan audiences. And there also just seems to be an indelible link that exists in popular culture between the movement and the Wicker Man. Like you can find books from the 80s and 90s talking about alternative religious movements that include a brief mention of paganism, and they will have a still from the Wicker Man where the women are like all like naked in the stone circle. Why do you think this film has the particular place it does for in many pagans' hearts, despite that what is happening in the film is very removed from anything that exists in the modern movement?
It's a great question. It's a really great question, it's such a great question that last year I felt compelled to write a book that was trying to answer that question, because it's a question that had kind of haunted me really from both of us from the start of doing the show. We noticed immediately that wherever we went, it drew audience, pagan audience, members of the audience, and then doing it in Glastonbury last year for the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, they were over the moon that we were bringing this for the weekend. And when Lord Summerisle appears for the first time in the film, there's a loud cheer, from the audience, and that line where he says, a heathen conceivably, but not a pagan, even though it doesn't really make a lot of sense, or we're not sure entirely what definitions they're working on. Again, kind of a cheer from the audience, and audiences, yeah, they generally do identify with Summerisle, identify with the rites and the rituals of the islanders and the lifestyle of the islanders, but nobody would identify with the the ritual sacrifice at the end. And I think it's so what I did that weekend, knowing that I wanted to write this book and I wanted to explore this question, was I arranged to meet with a bunch of druids, long-term members of OBOD, and ask them this question and see, what answers I got. It was very interesting. There's a guy, I can't remember his name now. I want to say it's Peter, but I could be wrong, who was an ex-policeman and druid. And I made a beeline for him, and I said, whose side are you on when you watch the Wicker Man? And he said, I'm on the side of nature, David. And I thought that's a great answer. That's a pagan answer. And that's a very interesting answer, because it's one that people rarely give. I'm not interested in the islanders or the policemen. It's in nature. That's what I care about. I think that, so one of the people I spoke to, he said that he'd been with his partner to the island. I think I'm right in saying it was the island of Iona, which is known for its, I don't know much about it, so I'm trying to recall what he said, but it's an island renowned for monasteries and kind of a Christian heritage, and there's sort of Christian tourism there. But behind that, before that, there's understood to be a rich pagan heritage on the island, but it's hard to find because of what's been lumped on top of it. And he was saying, we went there and we're reading between the lines with some of the poetry and some of the verse that we found. That was supposedly written by monks or priests or whatever, and actually that felt to have quite a wild sort of pagan tone to it. And we suspect that this poem, these words have been appropriated. And same with some of the buildings and the locations. And I mean, I live in Sussex, and a lot of the churches here are built on old burial mounds, and we've got Iron and Bronze Age hill forts. There's dozens of them all along the downs here. You've got to sift through, to find the gold, to find what you're looking for. And I think it's no different with the film. You take what you want and you disregard the rest. The film is terribly sexist. I came across this dreadful quote from Anthony Schaeffer in a book by a journalist called Alan Brown, who wrote a book called Inside the Wicker Man: How Not to Make a Cult Film, and it's a brilliant book, and it's written with a wonderful kind of acerbic tone to it. And Schaeffer was quoted as saying, "Paganism is all about sex, so the girls had to be smashers." Now you don't hear this word smashers anymore,
Not
but
really, no.
no. And if you think about the representation of women and sexuality in the film, first of all, it's incredibly heteronormative. There's an orgy that's about the closest you might get to breaking away from perspectives of sex and sexuality by white middle-aged men in the 1970s. But the women that they chose very deliberately, Britt Ekland and Ingrid Pitt, known to be attractive women who'd appeared in Hammer films and others, and Ingrid Pitt's character, thankfully, who was dubbed as the nymphomaniac librarian, that those scenes were kind of lost forever now. But they were cut. They didn't make it to the theatrical edit of the film, which is the one that people know the best. There's one scene where Howie is going around the island and he's trying to find Rowan Morrison, and he opens this door by accident, and she's there in the bath, and she puts a finger to her mouth and she looks all coy. There was a lot more of that in the original full-length version of the film, which would have been about 2.5 hours. So it's Britt Ekland, it's Willow McGregor who is offering herself to the young men on the island. There's no reverse of that. What about the young women? Is it reciprocal? That's not of interest. So there's lots of stuff that's really terribly antiquated and that we'd really question now. And also, not least, that the reason for the sacrifice of Howie is not for nature, it's not for ecology, it's not for the planet, it's for their bloody apples. Like Summerisle is a sort of a hard-nosed capitalist at heart, really, and that's why I liked that response of the policeman, the ex-policeman, saying, whose side are you on? I'm on nature's side. I thought that was, such an insightful response. But what the Druids said And what many people have said to us, many people have said to us over the years, is they see the film and they think, I want more of that in my life. I want that community. I want those rituals. I want to live in a place where you go to the local pub and people start singing and there's a folk session every night and there's an honoring of the seasons, there's an honoring of nature in meaningful ways. There is a cohesive community in that film. It clearly works. And Summer is clearly responsible for holding that together. There's a sense of freedom. There's as I said earlier on, that there's a limited idea of sexual liberation in that film. But limited as in what's presented as and so that those are important things. There is no, to the best of my knowledge, there is no positive representation of paganism in a film. You might correct me, there might be stuff that I haven't seen, but by and large, the pagans are presented as the bad guys. They're always presented as the bad guys, and particularly in the British folk horror scene of the 70s. There were television programs made like Children of the Stones, which is a terrific kids' TV series based around a kind of a mythological version of Avebury, and the local druid. He's the bad guy. He's the one who's harnessing this strange power from a distant star and turning people into stones and all the rest of it. And those dissenting voices are absolutely right in saying, in having the opinion of, I don't like these kind of programs. I don't like these kind of films like The Wicker Man because it's presenting this binary narrative, and it's presenting the pagans as the bad guys. There's no, there isn't much nuance. It's, like the film The Beach, isn't it? It's like the narrative of the beach. How far are you prepared to go to hang on to something that you care about? Well, we love our paradise. So yeah, somebody's got to die. Because someone, we might lose our paradise, we might lose our apples, we might lose our harvest. Somebody's got to die. These are very disturbing narratives for us to get behind. But so I totally understand why people can turn away from the film. But I think there's so much to enjoy about it that, as many people have said to us over the years, you take what works for you and you disregard the rest.
Yeah. And especially to talk a little bit more about the presentation of pagans, I can't really think of any media, with the exception of like HBO's Rome, that's older than the last 10 years or so, that really does give a sympathetic portrayal of European paganism comparatively. Like you have the exchange between the school teacher and Sergeant Howie, where he gets all like a bit, his hackles up, going, but don't they learn about the word of Jesus Christ? And she very calmly and confidently says, well, yes, in comparative religion, in a way that's just, there's a confidence to it that, I mean, I think like in most other, not just horror films, many other films, there would be some kind of shrinking away or like, oh no, it's the power of Jesus or something. That it's in that way, I think that's part of it as well, that these are people that are presented as being confident and secure in what they believe. And there's something attractive about that, I think.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and of course, they're talking there. What is she teaching? She's teaching about the maypole, isn't she? She's teaching about it as a phallic symbol, and we there is no real evidence that the maypole was ever a direct kind of metaphorical representation of the phallus. But again, that kind of we're buying into that kind of male gaze and colonial narrative, I think around that. But I absolutely agree with you. Yes, it's like they're very comfortable in their skins. They're very comfortable with their religion, and they present it in a way that you watch it and you go, yeah, I'd like to be part of that. It's like when the Jehovah's Witnesses come knocking on the door. There's no part of that. You go, oh, it's all a bit apocalyptic, isn't it? It's all a bit homophobic. It's all a bit doom and gloom. Oh God, But with this, yeah, you watch it and you think there is something compelling about that, and I think community is a big part of it. We live in an age in which I think many of us crave to be part of a meaningful community, a spiritual community, or it doesn't have to be a spiritual community, but this is why the likes of you and I are drawn to paganism, to groups like I've been a member of many groups over the years, and I've been with groups who have turned out to be a little toxic, a little too judgmental in their ways. And I always have this question, in my heart, which is the compassion at the center of this? Is that what drives it? Is the love of our fellow human being and the love and respect for the planet at the heart of this? Because if there isn't, I think I'm out of here. And I found that in Obods, and so yeah, so those I don't know where I'm going with that, but those are important elements to me. I forgot what your question was. I'm sorry.
No worries. Well, I think that's a good place for transitioning a little to some of your other works as well. You've written also like a really compelling monograph, The Cult of Water, on your relationship with with the River Don in the north of England. Just gonna make a quick note on timestamp there. Blah blah blah. What first inspired you to write The Cult of Water and to engage in the journey that you describe in it?
So the cult of water is it's a monologue. It's also a it's done as a performance with film and music and with ritual. And it's a journey up the River Don, which is one of our industrial rivers, once one of our most polluted industrial rivers. And it's where I grew up. I grew up in a town called Doncaster, and the River Don took its name from Doncaster. Doncaster was a Roman town, originally called Danum, and Danum took its name from the river's name, which was originally Danu or Danu, which is a Celtic goddess, and it's the Hindu goddess of primordial waters. Primordial waters. And when we think of rivers like the Don in Russia, or the Danube that flows through several European cities, all of these rivers took their names from Danube. Now, I grew up in a family who were very conservative and not very interested in culture, certainly not interested in the kind of culture that I found myself interested in when I left home at 18. But what we did do is we did a lot of walking. We spent a lot of time in nature. And the one thing that we never did was go anywhere near the River Don, because the River Don was declared biologically dead in the 1960s. So the River Don flows through Sheffield, and Sheffield was once the largest centre for steel industry. And the steel industry was notorious for pouring arsenic into the rivers. Am I right in saying it's arsenic? I think I'm right in saying it's arsenic that was used for cleaning. I could be wrong on this, but a toxic poison was used for clean as part of the cleaning process of creating steel. And so poisons were going straight into the river. Human effluence was going into the river, and the river water was being artificially heated, again as part of the cooling and cleaning process of steel making. And there was still industry all of the River Don. So the River Don was utterly abused, and it was a river that you just wouldn't go anywhere near. We'd go walking in the Pennines in Derbyshire, but we wouldn't go near the river. And when I reached, I think, my late 30s, and I was spending more time going back to Doncaster. My parents were getting old, and I was seeing more of them because they were getting more infirm. And I was also needing to spend time away, not only spending time with family, but also getting claustrophobic sometimes when you're too enclosed, and needing to relate to nature, connect with nature. I thought, bloody hell, this town was built on this river, and yet I've never spent any time with this river. I wonder what this river is like. What's the river's story? What's the river's folklore and mythology? So I decided to walk the river from Doncaster and to its source. I'd find its source. And this journey was, I wanted to reconnect with Danu, with the water goddess who'd given her name to this river, who had once been blessed and worshipped and treated as a living deity. And when the Romans, kind of invaded, and the Romans had sort of settled in Britain, we found evidence of coins and shields and swords that had been thrown into the water, known to be totemic offerings to the river goddesses. because they revered and feared bodies of water. And all of that changed. It all changed, as we know, with the Industrial Revolution. And I was looking for a story for this journey, and the story came to me. So the symbol that the Sheffield steel industry chose to represent it was Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and forge, and he stands on what was once the tallest building in Sheffield city centre, which is the town hall. And Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, once said, "You want to know who's got the power? Who's got the tall? What are the tallest buildings? Whoever's got the tallest building in the old days in the village, it was the church. They've got the power. And then, of course, what is it now? It's commerce. But once he stood on the top of the town hall, it was once the tallest building, and I was walking on my kind of second or third day, and past this river, which has been cleaned up a lot over the decades with wonderful work of some environmental groups. But I don't know if this has been news at all in America. Every place has its own major problems with environmentalism, environmental disasters, etc. But our water companies, which were privatized, well, I think we're one of only 2 countries in the world to have privatized our water. Ridiculous thing to have done. But our waterways, we're now learning, are way, way, way more polluted than we ever imagined, because it's the shareholders who come first. And so the water companies, do all they can to dodge things that they're meant to be doing to safeguard, the quality of the water, etc. But anyway, so the river is no longer biologically dead. There are some nice parts of the River Don, and there's a lot of work gone into it, but we know that our rivers are still heavily polluted. So I'm on this journey, and I see Vulcan, and I reach a point in the city where I can no longer access the river. The river was made deliberately inaccessible to us. It was culverted, it was canalized, and it was sealed off. And there's a frightening figure. I don't know what it's like for the States, but 97% of British waterways are inaccessible to the public. 97%.
Wow.
That's because of private land. And so we cherish what we have. And when I saw Vulcan, I realized that this is a mythological tale of a battle of the sexes, So once we had this female deity who was the river, who was this, seen as a living embodiment of the river, who was revered. And then what happened was we've been through an age of patriarchy for a long, long time. And what did we bring with that? Yeah, we brought technology, and we brought progress, and we brought destruction, and a sort of a disdain and an exploitation of nature. And so there he stands, the god of fire versus the goddess of water, looking down on hopefully with shame on kind of what he's created. So that became an interesting journey for me to start to look at some of the symbolism of which admittedly is now, would be considered as binary symbolism, which I think was important to our ancestors, and looking at the symbolism of the sword and the chalice in ancient kind of mythology, being male and female, and the monolith and the stone circle and the well, and finding these symbols coming up again and again through our Neolithic past, and trying to relate those as well to the binary code that drives our digital realm as well. It's very interesting that these symbols, the symbol of the line and the circle, they come up again and again and again. So this stuff was sort of bubbling up. Forgive the obvious water metaphor. And that was part of the journey. I also suffer thalassophobia, which is a profound fear of deep water. So I'm troubled with dreams where I'm often just lost at sea, and dark shapes are moving beneath me, and they terrify the hell out of me. And I had the good fortune to I got the chance to make a BBC documentary about this, and managed to spend 3 hours with Alan Moore, the comic book artist and magician, talking just about magic and river mythology and river goddesses, which was, that was extraordinary. And I was able to use elements of that conversation for the cult of water. So when I do it as a live show, I broadcast Alan's voice. And in print, I just it's there. Some of the quotes from that conversation. So those are key elements to it. And if listeners are interested to go and find a version of it, then it's on Spotify. So with my band Oddfellows Casino, we made a record of instrumental music, which I use for the show, and then a spoken word, a slightly shortened spoken word version of it, which is available, yeah, Spotify, YouTube, etc.
How did the process of the journey and the writing of the Cult of Water influence how you understand myth?
That is a question. That's a difficult question, isn't it? I've been thinking about this. Um, well, I mean, myth is something I've been fascinated by, I think, ever since reading Joseph Campbell when I was, in my late teens and early 20s, and really taken with, like some of the ideas, like the hero's journey. Also, in more recent times as well, recognizing the limitations of some of our mythological templates like that. But I was, I think I was aware of looking for a story, a myth to tell within this journey. And as I say, noticing the potency of a god of fire and a goddess of water within this journey, I felt compelled, or rather, I felt gifted with a means of bringing something mythological and mythological narrative into this. But also another story which wasn't connected to the River Don was one of someone whose son was dying of a of a rare lung disease, and him going out into this is a Sussex-based story, so I connect the two, perhaps in a tenuous way, but it's because of the sort of miraculous and ritualistic element of it that I love the story so much. Also because it's a true story. He took acid and went out into the wild woods and waterways of Sussex, to ask the god and goddesses for help because his son was dying, and he saw this fractal-like image of the waterways beneath him, and superimposed over the top, he saw the fractal-like nature of his son's lung, and he saw this blockage right in the middle, and was told or understood that if he found this blockage within the waterways of this wood he was in, then he would save his son. He would release the blockage from his son's lungs, and that's what he did, and he spent 6 weeks, and I've been there, and it's a boggy place. It's not a place you'd want to spend on your hands and knees for 6 weeks, sort of digging and finding this ancient channel, this ancient place of ritual. He found this beautiful spring, and a sort of pool within it, which was large enough to plunge yourself in, and do rituals, which is what came to happen, and him taking the water every day to his son in hospital. And after a year, his son pulled through. And very curiously, just behind this place, there was the old resting home of Aleister Crowley by chance, kind of lived about 100 yards away. So does that answer you? That doesn't really answer your question about my understanding of myth, but I think those sort of stories, just that, his name is Mark Golding. Stories like that, they have a mythological quality to them. I tell his story as he told it to me and told it to other people. And it's a story that you can read on many levels, I think. A scientific rationalist, reductionist kind of person might just say, oh, it's all baloney. It's all baloney, and his son is the medication, and he didn't have those. He just imagined it or whatever. And for someone else, the symbolism of that, they might see the potency of that, and someone else might take it literally. For me, mythology is, stories that serve us, stories that help us navigate and understand our place in the world. If a story is meaningful for you, and I think if it appears to be a narrative which has an inclusivity to it, and a sense of cohesion to it, and one which is one which is ecological. For me, those are the kind of myths and stories that I go looking for. And so those stories worked for the cult of water. Those were the stories I wanted, I wanted to tell. So that, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
You've also explored the role of myth on your podcast, Adventures in Nutopia. And one particular concept that you've described that I think is especially interesting is what you refer to as the loss of myth and how that's impacted the world we're living in. How do you think this whole thing of loss of myth has contributed to the present like status quo that we're living under now, with all that goes with that?
Well, that came from that was hearing Joseph Campbell decades ago in I think it was that conversation with Bill Moyers for the Power of Myth. It might have been that season where Campbell says in the 20th century we have deconstructed many of our established myths because they no longer serve us. And I don't think he's explicit, but it's pretty clear to me. He's talking about myths of patriarchy. He's talking about myths of colonialism. He's talking about, Christian dogma. And all of these things we know are work in progress. There's never going to be any endpoint for these. But then he ends with a caveat and he says, what the world needs right now are new myths to live by. And I just don't see where they're coming from. Now, he said this in, I think, the early 80s. And he was an advisor to George Lucas on Star Wars. And we look at the continuing influence and power of that myth, which is in some ways can be viewed as a sort of the classic hero's journey, but also it can be seen as a modern myth of the dehumanizing forces of technology and modern life. And that, we need to fight against that. That myth is there in Frankenstein, it's there in Faust. And also, it could be seen as a myth warning against the dehumanizing forces of fascism and the far right movements, dehumanizing of other people, the othering of people. And but I think Campbell, for years I thought about this, like where are these new myths? Where are these new myths of inclusivity? Where are these new ecological myths? Where are these myths that challenge the myths of capitalism, the myths of greed is good, the myths of winners and losers, the combative metaphors that we encounter in our everyday language, the mechanical metaphors that we encounter in our everyday language, all of which are, can be dehumanizing and don't honor nature. Nature is something removed from the mythologies that I think that we have lived by, whether it's the monotheistic, mythologies, which really push the idea of nature as being something to be exploited and to be tamed and to be controlled in a hierarchical way with, God at the top and man below and then nature below that. And even if you're an atheist, all you do is you knock the top guy off the top and then you carry on with that narrative as it is, and we still put ourselves first. But I've been heartened. Part of the reason for doing that podcast was to go seeking these new narratives. And I feel really heartened at how many new movements seem to be springing up, and I know that I'm looking for this, but they seem to have an ecological heart to them. Jeremy Lent, who wrote The Pattering Instinct and The Web of Meaning, is part of a group called Ecological Civilization, and I think their work is extraordinary. And alternative narratives of economic models, donut economics, being one. I interviewed Kate Rayworth, who's one of the many people behind this. The things that all of these myths that are coming up, political myths of the power of the commons, things that are shared, like Wikipedia is a great example of like, oh look, there's something on the internet that didn't get fucked up and abused and exploited, and actually it's an extraordinary example of like, wow, our social media might have been like this had the people behind those taken that model rather than the models that they have gone to. So I'm heartened that these new myths do seem to be manifesting. And what there's a diagram I found on the internet about 6 months ago, which was just so beautiful because you can meditate on the yin yang symbol, can't you? Like for the whole of your life and still not really get it. And there was one I found where it was just a triangle with humans. It's the great chain of being, basically, with humans at the top and nature below, etc. And you just have the word ego written at the top, and the other is a circle with all of nature and us included in that, and eco. And it's something very powerful, maybe cheesy, I don't know, but very powerful and very clear what that message is and the transition needed across everything from economics to politics to our financial systems to the way that we farm and think about food. These are the models that I think we need to transition to. And obviously that's pie in the sky stuff because the whole world is dominated by aggressive systems which exploit and extract, and leading us to a precipice. But those alternatives are out there. And the thing that they all have in common for me is they draw on ancestral wisdom, which is how do you learn to live as best you can in harmony with your environment? Because we know that our ancestors, they figured it out, because those that didn't aren't around for us to be able to see that they figured it out, because they would have not survived. And there is no way we can go back. I'm not someone with this kind of idea of Arcadian, this wonderful Arcadian past, but we can draw on other types of wisdom, whether it's the wisdom of Taoism, whether it's the wisdom of a group of people who have learned to live in relative harmony in a relatively hostile environment. To me, those are the elements, those are the myths that we need. But I do see them starting to manifest. As I say, I'm looking for them. But that's the point of the podcast for me, to bring some hope and inspiration. And there's a Dutch, is he a psychologist? I'm not sure what his title would be. There's probably many things, called Rutger Bregman. And Rutger Bregman wrote a couple of books, Humankind and Utopia for Realists. And in Humankind, he starts by looking at some of the narratives that have dominated psychology in the last kind of 6 or 7 decades, and the Stanley Milgram experiments in the 1960s, where Milgram supposedly proved that that scratch below the surface, and most of us are capable of being incredibly sadistic. I don't know if you know these experiments, but so he writes. Okay, so he writes about how he goes back to look at the data, basically, and explore whether or not Milgram just might have been perhaps out for his career to make a name for himself, because he certainly did. Then he looks at the Stanford Prison experiment, and this alleged story, which is people still talk about. A bunch of students left just for a few days as prison guards and as prisoners, and wow, and they all started beating each other up and going crazy. And when you actually think about it logically, you go, what, within a few days, really, a bunch of students would actually go crazy? And he explodes the myth around this as well, and talks to some of the people who were there, and again finds that it had been partly orchestrated, that there were egos involved. People wanted, when the experiment was tried again in different places, sometimes for live TV. I think it was tried in the UK in the 80s. Nothing happened. It was the most boring TV, because people just sat around for a few days going, well, then it's over in a few days' time. They're not going to go mad. So he starts to explore some of these supposedly established narratives around the idea that we are highly competitive, highly aggressive, that under the surface, we are deeply sadistic. And then he takes an established piece of fiction, Lord of the Flies, where we know the stories. Like, what would a bunch of schoolboys do if they're all left alone on an island? Oh, they'd all start shooting each other and putting each other's heads on spikes and and calling each other piggy, and so he goes in search of. Do you know this story or not?
Oh yeah, we read that in high school over
Right,
here.
right, okay.
And
No, sorry, I'm in the one I'm about to tell you. He goes in search of whether a real life example of this ever happened, and he finds one in Polynesia, and he discovers that a bunch of school kids had boys had stolen a boat one night and gone off fishing, got lost at sea, ended up living on an island for a year and a half, and they were eventually found. What did they do? They looked after each other. They got each other's backs. Nobody put anybody's heads on a spike. It's very interesting. That we have those established myths and narratives about ourselves, and maybe we don't celebrate ourselves enough. We look at the Campbell once said as well, that we forget that the news that we consume on a daily basis is the exception to the norm. That's why it's newsworthy. All the other stuff that's happening every day in most places across the world, it's just people just getting on with their lives, people cooperating, people just getting on with it. And then, the psychopaths, the sociopaths, the conflicts, those are the things that we highlight. And then we say, God, aren't we a disgusting race? This is what we go, well, yeah, but we forget that, we are, Darwin said that by and large, nature is cooperative, humans are cooperative. And yet that was forgotten as well. That was kind of shouted down, by the likes of Dawkins in the 70s with the selfish gene and this idea that, that altruism has to be taught because we're all ultimately selfish individuals. And when we look at the state of the planet and what we've done to it, yes, it's hard to acknowledge, but the point I was getting to, sorry, I like to talk. The point I was getting to is Rutger Bregman. I think it was Bregman, said at the end of one of his books, if you were to take all of the movements around the world that had ecological principles at their heart, that had sustainability at their heart, that had humanity and humanitarian causes at their heart, if you got them all joined together, you would find that you had this incredible grassroots movement that will be the most powerful movement ever known to humanity. And all those other movements of, those who want to bring on the apocalypse, those who want to stir up conflict, those who want to stoke the culture wars, pretty small. They're pretty small fry in comparison. And I think that's true. I think that if you could, I don't know how you could, but we have to take heart. You look at the power of Greta Thunberg and how one schoolgirl could mobilize, millions. And we have to take heart from that. If we don't, we're lost. We've got to have some hope, haven't we, I think, for what we're still capable of achieving in face of the almighty problems that are going on right now in the world.
Oh, that was great.
Oh, God, sorry.
Oh, no worries. Well, and I think it's important to be ending on that note as well of hope that it can be really easy, especially like, I mean, looking at the situation in the United States, for example, right now, or even what was predicted for the elections in France versus the actual outcome, that it's
Yeah.
easy to get lost in all of that. Of just to say, oh no, there's nothing we can do, but there are things that we are doing, not just can do, but is already happening.
You're right. You're right. We thought it was a foregone conclusion for France, and it wasn't. And even though we're seeing a rise in the far right across Europe, for once, in the last 10 years, Britain bucks the trend. For once, I mean, I know that our country's been the laughing stock for a long, long time, ever since Brexit and ever since, the sort of the dreadful human beings that we've had in power for the last 14 years that have just made the most awful, awful mistakes in the name of a very misplaced and skewed ideology, not in the name of the, of the people. And now it feels like you're never going to have a perfect person in power, but it's like we can all just go and relax for a little bit, and not go, oh, what fuck up's going to happen next? We had a prime minister for 6 weeks who lost the country £30 billion. She was only in power for 6 weeks, and still out there, kind of claiming that she was right and that she had the right economic model and all the rest. So, but it's like, yeah. So and suddenly, now the Tories are a thing of the past and may become irrelevant, and how quickly those things can happen. yeah, we need to be reminded and sort of take heart from that. So I guess we don't want to be talking about this, but
So thank you again for coming on today, David. This has been an incredible conversation. It's been
brilliant.
great to have you.
Thank
Um,
you.
before you go, do you have any projects you'd like to plug or places where people can find you and find out more?
That's very kind of you to ask. Yes, so I've got a website which is drbramwell.com, and on there there's lots of links to radio programs that I've made and links to books and all the rest of it. The podcast Adventures in Nutopia, I'm just in the process of recording the third series for that, which should be going out in autumn. But there's already about 14 episodes. These are all documentary. They take bloody forever to make because they're very labor intensive. I don't make it easy for myself, but they dive into some pretty hefty topics, looking at economics, looking at agroecology, looking at things like reality tunnels and Robert Anton Wilson's legacy in one of those, looking at pilgrimage and ritual and healing sounds. So yeah, that can be found on through Apple, through Spotify, YouTube, etc. And if anyone's interested in the music, particularly the Cult to Water, Oddfellows Casino is the name of our band of 21 years, and there's about 12 albums on Spotify, and again, you can find us on Bandcamp and all the usual places. So hopefully some people will go and have a little dive around and see if they find something that they like.
Thank you again for coming on, and it's been great having you, and it'd always be great to have you back on. Wherever it is that we see each other again, it's always a pleasure. And thank you again. And this has been David Bramwell on The Wayward Wanderer, and we are now signing off. If you want to find out more about radical heathen practice, head on over to onblackwings.com, where you can find articles, classes, resources, and more. This podcast was created and produced by Ryan Smith. Thanks for listening.